from the Federation of the Rwandan Communities in Australia, FRCA. I'm the Women Affairs. So thank you again. Before we proceed, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which we are meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So as I said before, my name is Delphine, and I am an Australian of Rwandan descent. And today we're here to remember the Operation Tamar. So it's Thursday afternoon in a busy working week. Many of you have taken a precious time from your work and other commitment to join us today in honoring the men and women of Operation Tamar. So we do thank you for that. I would also like to acknowledge our very important guests, our VIP guests, some of whom are already among us and some will be joining us later. And also I'd like to acknowledge people who are following us online, people who were unable to physically be with us today. So I acknowledge everyone. And also I would like to acknowledge the member of New South Wales Parliament, from both sides of the aisle who are already among us, and other MPs will be joining us in the sidelines of their parliament engagements. We also thank the many Rwandan guests, leaders of the African Australian community who have made it in person from around Australia, and also the people who are following us online. We acknowledge everyone. Last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge the men and women who served in Operation Tamar, who are among us today, and those following the event online. Your bravery in difficult circumstances and your presence among us today is immensely appreciated. To proceed, I would like to further acknowledge NOEL ZIHABAMWE, chairperson of the African Australian Advocacy Center, who is the convener of the event tonight. Thank you, NOEL. Now, I would like to invite NOEL to give us our welcoming speech. Thank you.
Honorable Ministers and members of Parliament, Australian and the state government representative, Director of New South Wales Office for Veterans Affairs, current and former members of the Australian Defence Force, esteemed academics, community leaders from throughout New South Wales, Rwandan community leaders and members who have traveled from interstate to attend this important event, board and executive members of the African Australia Advocacy Center, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to firstly pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand today. I pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all today to the commemoration of the Operation Tamar, where we acknowledge the brave actions of the Australian Defence Force personnel who risked their lives to save others in very precarious times in Rwanda, especially in the Kibeho camp. This event has been made possible because of the support of many organizations and individuals, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, STATS, New South Wales Services for Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma survivors, members of the Federation of Rwandan Communities of Australia, executive and the board members of the African Australia Advocacy Center, other people who have also given so free of their time and expertise to make this event happen. Of course, much of the coordination and organization of this event has made possible because of the expertise of Dr. Leon Hathwell. Leon, thank you very much for your passionate commitment to this event and everything that you have done. Today, we are here to honor the former and the current Australian Defence Force personnel who served in a peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, especially those who served in Kibeho and in Kigali under Operation Tamar. It is an honor for me to stand in front of you today as we remember and honor those sons and daughters of this land who gave all they had to provide life-saving and dignified service to help us, also to help people of Rwanda, which is my former homeland. Of course, this event is extremely important to Australian Rwandans as it provides us with an opportunity to publicly thank the Australian Defence Force personnel who were in Kigali and Kibeho, especially in Kibeho refugee camp in Rwanda, as a part of Operation Tamar. Especially at Kibeho, Australian Defence Force personnel not only provided medical treatment to the victims of the massacre in the diverse circumstances they gave, they also gave the victims a dignified burial if it was needed. To the former and the current ADF personnel who were at Kibeho and Kigali, many Rwandans unfortunately shared the trauma arising, of course, from the genocide in 1994, and of course, other massacres that preceded or occurred after the genocide. On behalf of the victims and the survivors of those atrocities, I would like to thank you all in a most profound way for your courage, your sacrifice, your professionalism, your compassion, and your humanity. Your work as peacekeepers gave hope to others where none existed. Decades have passed and life has changed for all of us because of our shared experience. But it is important for you to know that you are not alone. We are here with you to help in any way possible as we are forever joined by bonds of shared experience, mateship, and love. We hope that you will now consider us as a mate that you can free approach and rely on to provide support and who understand if you need to talk about our shared history. For this, we will always be grateful. And now we must all join together and lift each other up to a new and a brighter future in the spirit of mutual compassion, optimism, and love. It is through those sacrifices of others, such as Australian Defence Force personnel, especially at Kibeho, that we are here today to honor you. Australian Rwandans are grateful to the Australian government for sending such professional members of Australian Defence Force to far-flung corners of the world to protect the lives of others. We are also grateful that Australia has given many of us a safe refuge from the turmoil that we had previously known. The survivors of Kibeho and events prior to and after the genocide in 1994 has helped to mold us into the people we are today. We are tough, we are resilient, and we are survivors. We live in a democratic and safe country, and we are proud to be called Australian citizens. As Australian Rwandans, we now stand united in unwavering support of the ADF personnel who sacrificed so much in Rwanda, especially in Kibeho, to protect us. And we hope that our future together is peaceful and productive in our great homeland. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel, for your speech. Now I would like to invite Ms. KIRSTEN Keith, who is international criminal law lawyer and a former prosecutor on ICTR, And at the same time, I'll introduce David Sutton so that we can, I guess, follow each other. And Dr. David Sutton is a historian on the Australian War Memorial. Welcome, Kirsten. Then we'll have David. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by giving my thanks to NOEL ZIHABAMWE for inviting me to today's Gebeho commemoration. I first met NOEL in 2019 when I invited him to speak at another Rwandan commemorative event that was more focused on the legal aspects of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where I worked. And since then, I've been assisting him and the others at the African Australian Advocacy Center, or AAAC as it's known. The AAAC represents and promotes the interests of African Australian communities by providing advocacy research and policy outcomes in collaboration with different stakeholders, including but not limited to government, not-for-profit organizations, business and academia. While it's still a very young organization, the AAAC has undertaken various activities, including running a survey which then informed the AAAC's report to the Senate inquiry on issues facing the diaspora in Australia. And it's also partnered with Westwards to form literacy projects to enhance the skills of aspiring writers. So it's a privilege to work with NOEL and everyone at the AAAC to help the organization realize its goals. So as we all know, and indeed many of you here were directly impacted by the events in Rwanda, between the 6th of April and mid-July 1994, carnage unfolded in Rwanda with the widespread and systematic killing of thousands of civilians. While the true numbers will never be known, various sources estimate over 800,000, predominantly Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were killed in just over 100 days. Thousands of women and girls were also subject to brutal acts of sexual violence and others subject to serious bodily and mental harm. In response to such acts, the UN Security Council, using its powers under Chapter 7, which relates to the maintenance of peace and security, established the ad hoc International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. This was established in November 1994, so a short time after the genocide, and was situated in Arusha, Tanzania. Its primary mandate was to prosecute those responsible for the genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed between the 1st of January and the 31st of December 1994. This was the second such tribunal that was established by the UN Security Council, the first being the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was established in response to the events in the Balkans conflict, also in the 1990s. This period in the early 1990s reflected a commitment by the international community towards accountability for egregious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, giving rise to the creation later that decade of the Permanent Court, International Criminal Court in The Hague. However, the focus of today is not on the accountability of those involved in the commission of such horrific crimes in Rwanda, but it's worth highlighting that in fulfilling its mandate, the ICTR has convicted various senior military and political leaders for their role in the 1994 genocide. And while the UN responded to the allegations of genocide and other mass atrocities with the creation of the ICTR as an accountability mechanism, it was also involved in UN peacekeeping operations in Rwanda, including Operation Tamar. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, Dr. David Sutton, who can speak more specifically on this. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all very much for coming to this very special event. I'd just like to start by noting that unlike some of my colleagues at the Australian War Memorial who work, I guess, on conflicts that have been in the more distant past, I don't think I've ever given a talk on Australian peacekeeping operations without people in the audience who were there, be they as serving personnel or indeed people from the country to which Australians have deployed. And I'd like to start by just offering my deepest respect for everything that you've done and everything that you've all experienced, and all for my sincere acknowledgement that you will know more about this than I can ever glean from the books that I read. I see that as a bit of as daunting. It's always daunting speaking to people whose stories you're trying to tell their story back, but it's also an opportunity. So I do encourage all of you to reach out to me if you'd like to talk about what you've done, be you from the Australian Defence Force or indeed from the Australian Rwandan community, because the more I can learn, the better I can tell that story. And that's a big part of my job. And together we can make sure that the history is very well told. The Australian response as part of the UN operation UNAMIR was called Operation Tamar, and it ran from August 1994 to August 1995. 612 Australians deployed during that period in two, what they called Australian Service Contingents, or ASC-1 and ASC-2. The Australian experience of Operation Tamar came very much in the aftermath of the genocide. We did come after that genocide had happened, but Australians were exposed to some very difficult circumstances in that period. ASC-1 came quite early on in August 1994, where they established themselves in the Kigali hospital. The Australians were serving largely in a medical capacity. We were there to provide medical services for the UN mission, but we were authorised to use our spare capacity to help many locals, and that's precisely what Australians did. Australians provided many thousands of operations on Rwandans who had any number of ailments, from diseases as well as those affected by events that were happening in the aftermath of the Civil War, unexploded ordnance, things like that. Australians also provided things like meningitis vaccinations to around 25,000 people, for instance, in the camp at Kibeho. The Australians there, like I said, were in a medical capacity. ASC-1 was formed from more than 60 units drawn from all across the Australian Defence Force, thrown together quite quickly in order to be able to get those medical personnel to Australia, to Rwanda. There was also an infantry component, so 2-4 RAR, A Company, as well as cavalry, the 3-4 Cavalry Regiment, B Squadron of that, unexploded ordnance personnel, logistics. But the main thing was that medical, and it was Australians there in that medical and assistance capacity is the main thing of what they did. The Australians who first arrived in Kigali encountered an area that had been devastated by the genocide and was there during the aftermath of the Civil War. And they found the Kigali hospital in really terrible circumstances. And they had to work really hard to be able to clear that hospital in order to make it ready for and usable for those medical purposes. And those who experienced that did that in really terrible circumstances. ASC-2 had a similar experience providing medical capacity to Australia, to Rwanda. And of course, the memory of their service is very much dominated by the massacre at Kibeho on the 22nd of April, 1995. My job at the Australian War Memorial is a historian, and I'm working on galleries in order to tell these stories. And one thing that I'm very conscious of is the way that in Australia, because there were 32 Australians present during that massacre at Kibeho, it's come to dominate how many Australians who know that Australians served in Rwanda at all have come to remember it. But we also need to acknowledge that the Australian experience of Rwanda is more than just the events on that one day. 612 Australians served over the course of an entire year. And it's really important that we acknowledge the genocide and we acknowledge the service of all of those who served, rather than just focusing on that one event. And I very much would like to extend an offer out to all of you, be you Rwandan, Australian, or serving personnel, to please catch up with me if you'd like to be able to tell your story. When we work on this gallery at the Australian War Memorial, we want to tell the story of the Australian defence personnel who served there in Rwanda, as well as the Rwandans who experienced it. I really do heartily encourage you to do so, because we know we are telling the Australian experience of Operation Tamar, but we're also acknowledging that this is a Rwandan story too, and we want to make sure that that comes across. So I just would like to extend my respect to you all and thank you all very much for coming. And we'll now be hearing from, rather than me, who's only read about this in books, someone who was actually there. And I'll introduce, is it Bill coming up next? Okay, I'll let Leon come up. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see all your faces here. I know we have people from all over Australia here, which is kind of strange given that we're operating in this COVID environment, to be able to think about that we're in a place where we're physically having a conference about a very serious topic also. My interest in Rwanda started several years ago when I did research on the Rwandan genocide. I interviewed a number of Tutsi survivors, and I think the memory of those interviews and the individual stories stayed with me. I wrote in my diary that I came across what I call the I in genocide, and that's the individual. And I think, like, peacekeeping missions are the same. Over the last few months, I've been talking to a number of Australian peacekeepers who went to Rwanda. They arrived at different times. They have very different stories to tell, and it's an individualistic experience. The father of genocide, Ralph Bunche, while serving in the Congo in the 60s, he wrote a letter to his wife, Ruth, on the 4th of August, 1960. He wrote to her, "I cannot begin to tell you how complicated and maddeningly our operation out here is. It is like trying to give first aid to a rattlesnake. Peacekeeping is not an easy endeavor. I think a lot of the peacekeepers who will be talking today will tell you that you often go to a place and sometimes there's no peace to keep. You see and hear unspeakable things sometimes, but peacekeeping can always also be extremely rewarding. If you read about Ralph Bunche, that I just mentioned, the stories that he's telling, and when I talk to some of the peacekeepers who will be speaking today, Tracy Smart has some great stories also about how she took her experience from Operation Tamar with her, and it very much positively influenced her work. So again, I just want to welcome everyone here today. And then we're still waiting for the minister to arrive, Minister Lee. So he'll be here in a second. But while we're waiting for him, we're gonna first start with, I'll introduce Lieutenant Colonel, now retired, Bill Edward Pickering, also a former mayor, I believe. He's a jack of all trades, and I'll give the floor to him. Thank you.
Just need to get my reading glasses on, I'm sorry. It's a problem with getting old. Forum organisers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I guess to relay my experiences in helping to bring peace to a country half a world away. In 1994, I was serving in Townsville as the Senior Specialist Public Affairs Officer or Public Relations Officer for Defence for Northern Australia, and more specifically, the Ready Deployment Force based on the Army's 3rd Brigade. I remember receiving advice that I should prepare for a deployment to the African nation of Rwanda as part of a medical peacekeeping force, and that I would be in the advance party for the first contingent of Australians into the conflict zone. So I was part of the first group to set foot in Rwanda wearing an Australian Army, in that case, uniform. With little more than 2 weeks to get my affairs in order, I, along with a small group of selected servicemen and women, flew out of Townsville on an American Galaxy aircraft, which is huge, second only to the Russian Antonov, that was able to carry enough materials, vehicles, and weaponry to establish a rudimentary base and security ahead of the full contingent arriving 2 weeks later. On board were infantry and armoured corps personnel, an army engineering element, a medical team, and myself, the lone public affairs officer whose job started the minute we touched down in the capital of Kigali. And my job was to manage the throng of media awaiting our arrival. My job in Rwanda was essentially to promote the work of Australian Defence personnel across all three services by dealing with media in country, acting as a spokesperson, and importantly, generating media and news coverage ourselves with my team of cameramen and support personnel. As a former newspaper journalist who had also done some television reporting, this was a task for which I was prepared. It was, however, for what I saw, smelt, and heard in Rwanda that I was not prepared. We spent the first night at Kigali airport that had been secured by British troops. I remember the stench of human death to this day. The bloody skid marks and trails left by combatants, bullet marks, and destruction caused by larger caliber weapons. The next day saw us travel to Kigali Hospital, where the task was to secure the main hospital, remove debris and human remains, clean up and commence engineering work to make the facility as functional as possible. The media had followed us to the hospital, and I worked hard to control the pack to ensure our troops could do their assigned work with minimal disruption. Behind the main hospital was an NGO ward, where international aid agencies were desperately trying to save lives with little resources and manpower. It was into this environment that our few military doctors, nurses, and medical support staff with the advanced contingent were to provide immediate emergency assistance. I remember standing behind a half-constructed wall with a horde of journalists, TV camera persons, and photographers looking into a bombed-out medical theatre while Australians got to work dealing with war trauma. A young girl hacked by a machete had her leg amputated in front of us. A man who had trod on a landmine met a similar fate. And a young boy thrown into a fire received surgery to repair his melted skull. I was not medically trained, and to witness medical procedures like these, one after the other, was a shock to the system. But I endured knowing there was no one else to do my job. Eventually, the media pack left Rwanda due to a lack of infrastructure in the country to send out visual imagery effectively. You've got to remember, this was in the 90s. We don't have the internet the way we do now. Or to cover another crisis or war somewhere else in the world, which happens with the media. This allowed me to continue with pre-established media information processes, including a regular satellite telephone link back to Australia with radio stations, which allowed servicemen and women to tell their story from Rwanda back home. I also had a regular column with the Townsville Daily Bulletin, which was the newspaper in the area where most troops had come from. My work with the assistance of my cameraman, Jeff Fox, was to deal with the media issues where they arose, provide advice to UN headquarters as required, monitor media coverage, and most importantly, proactively keep the mission in the news in Australia. Particularly with television news, this meant irregular trips to Nairobi in Kenya to provide vision and imagery of stories we had produced so they could be uplinked to Australia and other international news services, usually at the cost of these commercial and national news networks themselves. We had great success with these stories, but there is one story in particular that foretold of what was to come in future at Kibeho. This event occurred just prior to my departure. Rukondo camp was another displaced persons camp. This was the first time you had seen the RPA actively go in and try to remove displaced persons. Our coverage, my cameraman and myself, managed to get the story of people being medevaced out of that area, our surgeons covering where they could some of the atrocities that occurred. Specifically, I remember a medical officer telling me that a little baby, which we had seen brought in, we filmed being brought into surgery, had been bayoneted. He told in classic detail the problem with sucking chest wounds, and this was actually recorded. Interestingly, with all of this, what that did was tell the story of how Australians could respond to what can only be described as an atrocious situation. Having collected that and written stories and so forth, obviously that story was in demand. The UN headquarters organised myself and my cameraman to fly immediately to Nairobi, where we uplinked the vision of that story and imagery, and of course, my written story to international media. It went worldwide. What that should have sounded, however, was an alarm to what was to happen, because we knew, well, I knew, that Kibeo was likely to be the site of the biggest atrocity to come. And in fact, I had warned my successor, who replaced me as the head of public affairs in Rwanda, that he was likely to find himself in a major situation. Unfortunately, I don't think the lessons were learnt. And if I can say from a personal level, at a personal level, my biggest concerns was the lack of coordination between military and NGO organisations. Displaced persons were kept in those camps because food was readily available. Within those camps were militia who were hiding behind the veil of a displaced population. And then you had a Rwandan Patriotic Army that wanted to disperse the people, but also get to the Interahamwe, which was the militia. One could argue that feeding massive populations, keeping them there and making them dependent, rather than providing food to smaller little villages and so forth, may have helped. But that's for the historians to decide, the logisticians, the politicians, and others. That is just one quick snapshot of some of my experiences. I did at times face some very severe possible consequences for my actions, a couple of conflicts, if you like, or stand-ups between myself and the RPA, but I endured. I was able in many cases to talk my way out of problems, because working in public relations is like working as a war correspondent, except that you wear a uniform and you carry a weapon, which actually makes you more powerful in that role. But what I would like to say, and how I would like to end today's comments, is this. We all felt sympathy for the Rwandan people as peacekeepers. We did everything we could to save lives. We did everything we could to get the story out of what we were doing there and the value that Australian servicemen and women were providing to this country in a tragic time. Literally the message that we went back to, and as the PR guy behind it, I was responsible for delivering the key messages, which the troops were more than happy to deliver. And that was, we've saved thousands upon thousands of lives. We've worked with integrity, dignity, and most importantly, we never backed down to any force that or problem that come our way. We did our job as Australians. And I must say, I'm proud of those people, and I'm proud to be Australian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Pickering. And we do appreciate the work the mission did in Rwanda. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Geoffrey Lee to speak to us. So he holds many roles, but today he's in his capacity of New South Wales Minister for Sport, Multiculturalism, Senior and Veterans. We also would like to thank you for hosting our event. Thank you and welcome, please.
Well, good afternoon, and can I start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise that theirs is the oldest living culture in the world. And can I say welcome to New South Wales Parliament, the oldest parliament in Australia, and one that is one of the oldest continuous operation. Can I recognise some of our important guests here today? And it is fantastic to be able to host today's event. But can I recognise the chairperson of the African Australian Advocacy Centre, NOEL? Where are you, NOEL? You're here. Welcome. Theo Philly, President of the Federation of Rwandan Communities in Australia. Good to see you. Is Colonel Michael Miller here, the official secretary to the Governor? Very good person, very good person. I normally see him at the Governor's house. My ministerial colleagues and parliamentary colleagues. And can I also acknowledge any current serving or past serving members of the Australian Defence Force, and can I pass on our gratitude for your service for our country. Friends, thank you for coming together today to commemorate the Australia's participation in Operation Tamar. In October 1993, the UN established the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda, which replaced the previous UN and Organisation of African Unity observing missions. The mission was to oversee a peace agreement between the Rwandan government and the RPA. Operation Tamar, as we became known, involved the provision of Australian Medical Support Group consisting of medical company, an infantry company, and logistics personnel. 2 contingents of Australians served in Rwanda between 7 August 1994 and 23 August 1995, and that's a total of 652 different personnel. The first Australian service contingent established medical facilities in Karagli, the capital, and other small towns. The second Australian service contingent began and arrived in late February 1995. It continued the medical work in Karagli, and spread its operations further afield. In July 2019, personnel who served in the first and second Australian service contingents in Rwanda were served the Meritorious Unit Citation, a fitting recognition for their extraordinary courage, discipline, compassion throughout their deployment. And the legacy of the service in Rwanda continues to be remembered by many veterans of Operation Tamar to this day, who are rightly and should be proud of the work they did and the many lives they saved. Events like today commemorating peacekeeping missions are important. Whilst we often commemorate World War I, World War II, and large military conflicts, we should never forget the role that our peacekeeping forces play in other countries. Australia has had peacekeepers in the field with the United Nations since 1947. And Australia were part of the very first group of UN military observers anywhere in the world, and in fact, the first into the field. In the Hall of Service in the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park, we have the names and samples of soil from 100 different military significant sites to service personnel from New South Wales, including a soil sample from Rwanda that represents the service of our peacekeeping force throughout the region. I would like to thank all the members who served in Operation Tamar and their service for their contribution to the peacekeeping effort. Thank you for your service.
it's really hard to follow some of those speeches that have already been made. So I don't envy the next speaker, but I know she is an incredible speaker. She doesn't need much of an introduction, but I would like to say that she has been instrumental in helping to bring people to the table, a number of peacekeepers to tell their stories. Air Vice Marshal, now retired, Tracy Smart. She's also a professor at ANU, and she has just had an incredible career. So I think we are about ready to get her online. Can we see if the audio works, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. We're so happy to hear you. I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Leon. And look, it is a real privilege to be here today. I wish I could see the faces of the audience there. I'm looking at an empty podium at the moment, but I can see some of my colleagues and others on Zoom with me. So I do appreciate the opportunity. It was my intent to be there in person, but my day job got in the way, unfortunately, today. So as background, I was a squadron leader when I went to Rwanda, and my roles were, first of all, I was a senior RAF person in the contingent, or senior RAFI as we like to call it. I was also the Aeromedical Evacuation Operations Officer, so running aeromedical evacuations, and also running clinical services in the hospital as OIC clinical services. So I very much bring a different point of view, the medical point of view, to this discussion. As Leon said, there is an I in genocide. There's no I in peacekeeping because it's a team effort. But nevertheless, it is everybody does have their own stories and memories of their time in Rwanda. And most of my memories are positive. That's the way I look back now. I look at the beautiful country of Rwanda. It was so good when we were able to get out into the countryside and just to marvel at how a beautiful country it was. And despite the scars of the genocide that had occurred the year before I was there. I also remember the people, how great it was to interact with them. And I also remember there was a bit of wariness at times, you know, what were we there to do? But generally we broke down barriers and it was wonderful to be able to help so many people. It was also wonderful as a doctor to get such great clinical experience. I saw diseases in Rwanda I had never seen outside of the textbook. So it was a great learning experience for me and for others there in terms of seeing and treating those diseases. So I learned a lot from my clinical time over there too, as well as treating a lot of obviously the war-related injuries as well. But most of all, on the positive side, I remember the children. I remember going out into the community and meeting the children. I also remember the children in hospital because when I looked in their eyes, I saw, we had a lot of fun together. I remember them calling me Dr. Mzungu all the time and having a bit of a laugh. But I also remember that they gave me a lot of hope for the future and what Rwanda could become after this traumatic time. And that was an amazing experience treating those children, treating the adults. And as I said, from a clinical point of view, back on bases, we like to say we see coughs, colds, and sore holes. But there we were able to actually make a difference. We were actually able to save people's lives and or positively influence people's lives. And there's nothing better for a health person to be able to say that you've done that. Often you can't see that connection between what you do and what the impact is, but we really could in those circumstances. But of course, those positive memories go hand in hand with a lot of traumatic memories. You know, things like walking through the streets of Kigali after a heavy rainfall and having seen the bodies in a mass grave that had been washed away by the rain, walking across through remains on the street. You know, going up to see the gorillas, being stopped at a roadblock and because of a miscommunication, things got quite dicey and we were a bit concerned there with rifles pointed at us at the time. And also I went down to Kibeho 2 weeks after the massacre and to see the conditions people were living in down there, see the degradation and the just really unsanitary conditions, and to see how people were suffering, that was obviously very hard as well. But, you know, like my best memories were the positive ones of the kids, my worst memories also are related to some of the decisions we had to make with some of the kids. Because sometimes we had to, and adults too, but we had to let people die. We didn't have the resources we needed in country, or we didn't have the resources they needed to have a long-term recovery available in country. And so this was really traumatic. And oftentimes we would keep trying to help them in a place like Australia because we had those resources. But in places like Rwanda, after the genocide, we just weren't able to do so. And I still remember just around Anzac Day, our little girl, 2-year-old orphan who had measles and encephalitis, and I had to make the decision to let her die. And no amount of medical school ever prepares you to make that decision about that little girl, Savarina. So these playing God type things, I think, were the things I find, still thinking back, the most difficult to deal with. And of course, you know, we all know it was a very traumatic mission for nearly everybody who was there. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the mission, it did result in a really high rate of mental health issues amongst members of both contingents. And of course, we're talking PTSD, and I think also maybe moral injury, which is something I think we're starting to understand a little bit better these days. But I think a lot of people had real problems after Rwanda. But for some reason, and my trajectory was quite different. I look back, I see my peacekeeping time in Rwanda as actually the key to my career, to my resilience, and it is even why I think I got post-traumatic growth during my career. So actually, my response to trauma was a positive one. And I think there are 3 reasons why I had a different trajectory and I got lucky. And the first of all was, I think, from being a doctor, I was able to serve in Rwanda with a really strong sense of purpose. It goes back to what I was saying before about making a difference and changing lives. And my mantra in Rwanda, and some people will remember from my contingent, was we're here to help and we're doing a good job. You know, when it got stressful, this is what I'd say to remind myself and to remind others, so much so a couple of nurses on the contingent wrote it on my door of my accommodation and, you know, put it there for everyone to see. And I think, again, that was a really important part at the time. I came away thinking I'd done a good job and we'd done a good job and we'd saved people. And I look back as the years go by and I see the success Rwanda has become on the international stage. And I'm even more proud and even more feeling that we did good and we did something that was very important at that time. The second reason why I think I had a different trajectory is because I was able to talk about my experiences very early on. I call this letting the pus out, the good doctor that I am. Rather than bottling things up, being able to talk about it made a huge difference. And I was really lucky because the day I got back to work at RAF Base Williamtown, the CEO of a fighter squadron rang me up and said, Tracy, I want you to come and talk to my fighter guys about your experiences in Rwanda. And he introduced me there by saying, you guys, you're fighter pilots, you think you're the sharp end of the Air Force, but you're going to hear from the doc who's actually been at the sharp end. So that was very validating. And it was a very raw talk. It had lots of gory photos. A few of the guys had to leave. One of them said to me 20 years later that he still remembers that presentation. But the effect that it had and the validation of what a great job we've done was really important. That was the first time I told the story, but I did it then on a regular basis as part of my job at the Institute of Aviation Medicine for new doctors and nurses coming in. And that helped me let that pus out, helped me start processing what was going on. The third important reason, was that I got help when I needed it. This is perhaps the most important thing. I like to say, if you're having some sort of problem, regardless of what it is, you get help as early as possible, but it's never too late. Now, when I got back from Rwanda, I had the routine psych screens, but I didn't really follow up any of that because I got back to work and I talked to people about it and I seemed to be doing okay. But 4 years later, I went to a fatal aircraft accident in Malaysia. And it was an F-111 accident. And my job was to do the accident investigation, but also to retrieve the bodies of two people I knew really well. And that first night after doing that, I had a nightmare, a very, very bad nightmare of being back in Rwanda. And what I realised was I hadn't fully processed it. I still had stuff there that I needed to sort out. And if I didn't do anything about it, it was going to cause me harm. So when I got back to Australia, I was able to organise not only follow up for the team members I was with, but also went to see the psychologist myself. Now, I went early, so it was really just a couple of sessions that I needed, but that was such an important thing to do. It really set me up for success. It gave me the skills to actually work through this, both of these traumas. It helped to make me more resilient, and it set me up to be able to deal with the inevitable traumas that came as I continued my career in the Air Force. So that was really important to me. So 3 things. Finding a sense of purpose, I think, is really important. Letting the pus out and getting help when you need it. I think they have been the keys to me developing this post-traumatic growth, to me becoming successful in my career. So it turned what were a whole heap of negative experiences into a big positive in my life. And I think, so when I look back now, I really look at it as an honour and a privilege to have served as part of Tamar in the service of peace and the people of Rwanda. I'm really proud I'll forever have a connection with Rwanda because of my service there. And I wouldn't be the person I am today without that experience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy. You can't see this, but you got a huge applause here, and a lot of people have smiles on their faces too. I think when I grow up, I want to be like you one day. You give us you give us great inspiration, and you're right. I think Australia has done extremely well and done the country proud in Rwanda. One of the statistics that I read is that in Kigali alone at the hospital, you treated over 9,000 people. And that's excluding a number of the other smaller satellite camps and areas where you provided some medical aid to a lot of people. Now in Kibeho alone, for example, 25,000 kids were vaccinated to prevent meningitis. So a lot of people are alive also today because of the type of work that the peacekeepers who are here, the work that you've done, and we thank you for that. And then the next speaker is Blair Tidy. He's currently still serving, but he's here in his personal capacity. He's a warrant officer, first class. He is also very much an intellectual when he's not doing things for the military. He's currently doing his PhD. And while he does a lot of touring of different historical sites, so he's also a bit of a historian. His PhD historically is related to history, and he's got some interesting stories also to tell about Rwanda. And while he makes his way to the podium, I'd also like all our speakers, starting with KIRSTEN, David, Bill, to make their way to the stage. And we would like to ask Tracy Smart just to stay online also for the Q&A. And I'll give over to Blair Tidy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. It's a very humbling experience to be here today. I don't think I'm anyone particularly special. I'm only one of 600 plus people who served in Rwanda in AAC 1 and 2. So one of one story out of 600, and many still to be told. I was a reservist before I went over on AAC 2. I was called up full-time service from the intelligence unit in Nogra. Trained up and we deployed in early in 95, one of 5 analysts plus 2 interpreters that deployed on that mission. I was a corporal at the time. I was not quite 25 years old. And we had a mission over there to take over from our particular Mil Info section from ASC 1, who did a wonderful job. And again, as Dave Sutton was saying here before, the story of ASC1 is one that's not as told as often and as widely as it should. I remember coming into Kigali at the time and listening to some of their stories during the handover and saying, what have we got ourselves into? Again, a operation for their contingent was marked by some very short, sharp and numerous incidents. And again, something that I believe should be told even more. I think probably besides getting the handover from my previous teammates, I got some great advice early on from Canadian senior NCO. And he said, just remember, you yourself, this comes from a lot of UN experience himself, you yourself can't change the country. You can't change what is happening as an individual. But as an individual, as a small team, the small actions that you do make a difference in some people's lives, and they will. So take that to heart, and as a sort of combined effort, the 300 of you will do a number of things that will make the place a little bit better. So don't go home thinking you've failed because you haven't solved the problems. Go home thinking you've done a good job. And that was sort of very, very good advice at that time. My job in Intelligence Corps, very similar to anywhere else, is to find out what's going on and figure out what the threat is to our forces. Vast majority of information came from the United Nations, a very, very varied amount of teams out there, contingents, military observers from all over the world who had a vested interest in finding out what was going on and pushing the mission forward, trying to do their utmost to make a difference on the ground. We worked out of Kigali. We worked out with elements and went out into the field, and I got to see most of Rwanda during that time. One of the things that we had with us was a very early model digital camera, which is probably about this big, massive lens. Everyone jokes there's no such thing as lightweight military equipment. It's just equipment that they tell you is lightweight. So again, this came into play later on in places like Kibeho as a very useful piece of kit. Certainly my impression of the Rwandans overall, wherever we went in the country, was they had suffered a great deal, very, very tough people, but very friendly, and these sort of alien creatures with blue hats and berets and weapons sort of coming amongst them, not speaking much of their language at all. And again, it seemed to bring the best out of the Australians. There's always a smile, a wave, something you could be doing to help, to play with the kids, comfort the adults. And again, it was really the fortitude and the resilience the Rwandan people came out after all they had gone through and all they had suffered. One of the big jobs for ASC2 was again Kibeho. I was actually down in the area the day that the camp closed. I was down there with the legal officer, one of the detachments. We got down there, we found out that the camp had been closed by the RPA. We get new orders, go and find out what's happening in the camp. After the legal officer went home, I stayed on with the medics and the infantry there, assisting them in their role, but also doing the stuff that intelligence people do. We make reports, we talk to people, we take photos, we do sketch maps. And part of my role as again, just doing my job, I had I guess, felt I was doing something to try and let people know, at least in my chain of command, what was happening. Accurate and reliable information. And again, a horrific situation beyond most of our comprehension. But again, what did we do? We got down and we did the job that we were trained to do. Again, sometimes that's all you can ask for. I certainly spent my time out there assisting the medics and the infantry. And again, some of the stuff we saw there, it will be with us forever. Absolutely horrific injuries. But I think too, going back to the advice of the Canadian senior NCO is that it's those small things that you do as an individual. You made a difference in one person's life. One instance sticks with me. I was on a stretcher party with a mother who'd broken her leg, and her son was probably 18 months old, had been left with another party, and they'd been separated. So we were, as usual, dragging our stretcher around, got the woman to medical assistance. Son was not visible. could not see anywhere. Now, luckily, this young child had quite prominent front teeth and had a reasonable idea of what they were wearing. So I was able to go to the, I think it was the Red Cross at the time, and actually identify the child and say, this child's mother is over here at our CCP. He was slightly reluctant to hand over a child to an armed soldier. I can understand that. But hopefully I was diplomatic and said, look, if I'm wrong, I'll bring him back. I'm only just over here. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm very happy to say that I found the child, found the mother, got them together. Took a quick shot of my camera of this child sitting on the back of one of our trucks. And that photo is now hanging up in my lounge room at home. So again, going back to that advice that I got early on, it's those small things you do yourself, which you can look back with pride and say, yeah, we did something good. Certainly my overall experience, and I think one thing about that incident in particular is that we were one of the first contingents to have critical incident debriefing. So again, Army and ADF are getting better at psychological support, okay? And it has continued to get better, and it needs to get even better as we go along. And again, it's good to see things like veterans' mental health are now becoming mainstream issues with the Australian public. When I did my psych debrief, I said, look, this is a very horrifying situation. It's beyond anything I expected, but I felt that I actually did a good job, and I was quite proud of that. I was really happy with that. And it comes back to what Tracy Smart was saying about post-traumatic growth. Within this horror, there's also a recognition that you're able to survive, you're able to do something, and this may propel you to do something different that you did than you were thinking about before. So I came back from Rwanda in August 95 with the rest contingent. Not doing too much. I went back to my reservist lifestyle, but I enjoyed the camaraderie of being in the Army so much, working as a small group together, and working to do good, that I actually decided to join the regular Army. I'm still in it over 25 years later. I didn't plan to stay in for 25 years. It just feels good, and it still feels good. So I'll keep doing it. They keep paying me every 2 weeks. And it's taken me a lot of different places. And I've been to Iraq, I've been to Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, and talking about things coming full circle. I worked in Vietnam for 3 years in our embassy, which one of my jobs was preparing the Vietnamese hospital to go to South Sudan. So things come full circle sometimes in your career. I certainly did have trouble with my mental health in the immediate aftermath of Rwanda. Still have issues to this day. But I'm very lucky that I had in my particular company, in particular unit, people who had been through the same experience and were able to say, hey, you're having trouble. To the point where I'm now going, I can recognise when I'm having issues and I can seek treatment. And I've tried to use my experience for my soldiers, more junior soldiers now, to say, hey, if you're having trouble, go and get help. It's not a bad thing. It's not a black mark on your record. I think too that beside the changing attitudes of mental health, it also changed the way the Army and ADF looked at peacekeeping of the Rwanda operation. We had their 4 medals of gallantry at the time. The conversion to the the Australian Active Service Medal, the recognition that these are dangerous situations. And I think too the crowning part of that is the meritorious unit citation last year. Not normally, not previously signed for peacekeeping, but for wartime. And I think too that our experience and the story we've been able to tell have been pivotal about that, and say it's not just war, not just peacekeeping. There are things in the middle which can be extremely dangerous, and all the rest. I'll leave with just 2 quick things, and it's really for the veterans that are here today in the Rwandan community who are here or online. The first is tell your story. Please tell your story. I'm only one of 600. My experience is very, very small and very, very focused. So please go out, tell your story to your family, to your friends, to your colleagues, and obviously to the War Memorial as well, as Dave was saying earlier. And also with mental health, both for the veterans and for the Rwandan community as well. Reach out. look after yourself, look after others, okay? There is a growing acknowledgement that this is not just something that lasts for a short period of time. This is something that's going to be with us for a lifetime, okay? But please look after yourself and look after others. Thank you very much.
Yes. Sorry, it's one of those parties where you have to bring your own chair. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We've heard some incredible stories here today. And for some of us, it's the first time we're actually meeting in person. We've only spoken over the phone. So I was running around trying to see where Bill was for a while. And of course, Blair, I spotted immediately. Yeah, thank you again for being here and for sharing your stories. And again, Minister Lee, also thank you for you coming. This is your house. And we know you are very much pressed on time. So thank you so much for that. We're gonna jump into a Q&A immediately. We started a little bit late and we experienced a little bit of technical issues earlier, but there's one person who I also want to acknowledge who should have been here. He came all the way from Queensland to be at this event, to MC for us, Bertrand Tugandame. And if you're online and you're listening, thank you for being here. Unfortunately, he had to get a COVID test, with the result being that he's still waiting for the results, so he can't leave his hotel room. But you are very much in our thoughts, so thank you for that. All right, before I give over to these individuals, before you can ask questions to them, I just want to see if there are any other peacekeepers in the audience who feel that they would like to say something. If you could just raise your hand. It doesn't have, we have someone there in the back, please. Thank you. If you could just introduce your name and affiliation. And
thank you very much. And I appreciate being here this afternoon. Bob Luz, name. And I was a surgeon in the first contingent and experienced all the things people have talked about. But the reason I just wanted to speak today was that I chair the National Centre for Veterans Healthcare, which is centred at Concord. And for any veterans who need help, we're there. And it's a one-stop shop. We've recently completed some housing accommodation for families, so we're prepared to treat the veterans and their families. And I think it can come on at any time and it never goes away. But thinking about the group here today, I'm sure most of the Rwandans here today have gone through the same sort of experience. So post-traumatic stress is a very common thing in our community these days. And it should be recognised beyond just the military. The only other funny thing I thought about, intelligence, I could never understand as a surgeon why people wanted to take away the amputated limbs and x-ray them, but they were looking for the fragments of the different weapons so they could identify if it was French or if it was Russian or if it was Saudi Arabian or whatever. So the role of intelligence was something as a surgeon I never really thought about, but I'll tell you what, it's very important in that sort of situation. So thank you for all your work as well. Cheers.
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you for also talking about PTSD and the trauma that a lot of people in this room have experienced. I always have to remind myself also, you know, when I speak to Noel, he's a very strong person also, but he's also had a traumatic experience like many of the community leaders here and many of our peacekeepers who are sitting here. So thank you for saying that also. Okay, I want to see if there are, I would like to start with a physical audience here. We also still have Tracy online as far as I understand, and you can direct any of your questions to them. The only condition is that unless you are a peacekeeper, of course, I would like you to start your statement with who, what, where, or when, or how. Please don't make statements, just ask a question directed at the individuals. Thank you. Thank you, right there. Yeah, and if you can just identify your name and affiliation and ask your question. Thank you.
My name is Emmanuel, and I'm Rwandan. Thank you so much, the panel and the organizers, and I so much appreciate the life you went through. My first question is about whether in the camp of Kibeho, you mentioned that there were militias. So the question is, were militias armed? And if they were armed, what do you think as a peacekeeping force that was looking after the camp where there were civilians? Secondly is, you also mentioned that you saw the tragedy coming. As a peacekeeping force, did you have a chance at least of talking to the RPA who were on the other side, probably looking at the militia and the camp as well? If you had such a kind of discussion and conversation with the RPAs. Lastly is, as Rwandese, whether individually or collectively as a community in Australia, how can we support or work with you as you heal from your traumatic stress? We may have different capacities of understanding the situation of what happened in Rwanda and probably be part of trying also to help at this level. At that level, you helped while we were not probably present, but we would feel grateful to also assist in your healing process if we can as both communities. Because I guess as he mentioned at the back, we went through this experience together as a society, as a community who lived through it, but you also as a contingent that served during the difficult periods. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the next person asking questions, I just want to ask if you direct your question at someone specific also, then it makes my job easier. I just want to see, is there someone who would like to take the first question on the militias in the camp?
Sure.
Thank you.
I can address the first two questions.
Excellent.
The first question, yes, there are definitely weapons in the camp. Weapons were recovered by the RPA during the sweep through. We also cited weapons in the central compound during the later part of the operation. So talking small arms, AK-47s, G3s and the like. So a variety of weapons were there, absolutely. I'll also note that the majority of wounds we were dealing with, other than on the 22nd, were machete wounds. So it's an everyday farm tool as well as a deadly weapon. So when you talk about weapons, yes, there were small arms there, most definitely. There were also a lot of people with machetes as well. So again, a lot of injuries to that. In terms of knowing that the camp was going to be closed, it was a general government policy of the Rwandan government at the time that the camps inside Rwanda should be closed. And that was a generally agreed policy with the UN as well. So again, it is far better for people to be resettled back into their home communities, and the situation, the very dire situation in some of those camps to be closed. We were very much junior partners there with the UN, and I'm not privy to the larger conversations that were going on between the UN command and the Rwandan government. I can imagine that they were talking about the fact that, yes, we need to have some way of peacefully closing down the camps and resettling people back in their home communes, because that was a general campaign objective that the UN had at the time. The question is when and how, and you can see from what happened in a number of those situations that it was not the way that I think anybody had planned on closing down these camps. And that's the central tragedy of it all, is that, you know, it was thought of, it was seen as an issue that had to be solved, a challenge, but nobody had this in mind in the early phase. I guess that's it from my perspective. But actually, that last question, reaching out to the Australian veterans, I think, is probably the best thing. I certainly know with there's a lot of frustrations out there of people who have served, but to, I suspect, meet somebody who's come from Rwanda, who has successfully emigrated and is enjoying a good life in Australia, probably a very good thing for an Australian veteran. I can sort of speak from my perspective, meeting people from the Rwandan community. So yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, look, the question obviously comes from my statement in relation to the Interahamwe, the militia and so forth. Yes, look, it was generally known that weapons were being hidden. There was also some concern within the displaced persons community. People themselves were being intimidated by members of the militia. And obviously they were using them as cover to protect themselves against the RPA. Look, there was a terrible uniting of circumstances. It was easy for a group of people to hide within a larger group. They were being given food and so forth by the Red Cross, which for humanitarian reasons was the right thing to do. It was well known that the government at the time wanted these displaced camps basically dispersed. The reason being that obviously until they're dispersed, the community can't get back to normal is one. And the other one is, of course, there was a belief in some circumstances that people were being held in these camps beyond their desire. In other words, they wanted to return, but were being encouraged to stay. Look, there is no simple answer to that. The reality is that the result was horrific, but we should have, we were given enough information and indication to know it was happening, what would happen, and it was well known. And don't forget, I also deal with intelligence at a different level, and that is the media side of things. So I was getting other information from other sources and so forth. But it was well known that if something didn't happen quickly, then this is what was going to happen. That was well known by UN headquarters. It was certainly well known by the officers, senior officers and warrant officers, etc., within our contingent, because we had to be aware of that to look after our troops, potentially getting in the middle of a conflict, which is what happened anyway. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Yeah, thanks. And if I could just add to that, we know that the way that the camps are being operated happened in the context of Operation Retour or Return, in which they were trying to get people to go back to their villages and return that sense of normalcy. And as you pointed out, the non-government organizations or NGOs were stuck in this hard place. They did want people to move back. They understood that that was for the best, but at the same time, people were being attacked perhaps as they were going from those IDP camps to their villages. And that resulted in some camps, such as at Kibeho, becoming even larger than it was before. So people were going from other camps towards there. So it created this enormously complicated situation. Another part to that is, seeing what might have been happening. We'd seen attacks at other camps. You mentioned one of them in your talk. Yeah, there was also one at Busanze where I believe 12 people were killed. And that was something that the first contingent members were present at in the aftermath. And it's often seen as, I guess, a sign of things to come, which happened, of course, at Kibeho a few months later. So it's an experience that happened for a lot of Australians, and part of a really terrible situation and a terrible time of people trying to get some sense of normalcy in the aftermath of such horrific events.
Thank you. Tracy, if we have you online, I don't know if you want to weigh into this discussion.
No, look, I think what's been said is pretty much the understanding I had as well. You know, certainly when even 2 weeks after the massacre at Kibeho, we were wearing flak jackets and helmets and armed, heading down to the camp because of the threat, the potential threat that was perceived to be still there. So yeah, it's I think that was the commonly held you know, view of what happened. And yeah, it's yeah, I think the word is complex and difficult, and yeah, combination of various factors.
Thank you. And is there anyone who would like to answer the question? Tracy, you're also welcome to answer this. The third one about how Australians and Australian Rwandans can work together to perhaps heal. I don't know if there's...
Look, I think that's really, I mean, I know what it meant to people, including myself, to see so many Rwandans at our meritorious unit citation last year. It was an amazing, in a very bad year, it was a real highlight to have that, to reunite with people, but also to have so many Rwandans there as well. So look, JJ Fruin, who was on the first contingent, and I had been toying around the idea of having some sort of I guess, Tamar association or something like that, you know, making it some sort of organisation that could bring us together. At the moment, the Facebook page that many of us are on is probably the main way to get together, but that is a possibility that, you know, that maybe we can look at becoming an entity and make a more formal arrangement. But otherwise, I think it's a matter of perhaps us knowing who is the best point of contact in each state, in each location, and we may be able to make connections through that Facebook page or something like that. I'm not sure if anybody else who's online here has got any thoughts about that, Lynette or anybody else.
Yep, I do. I raised my hand, but I don't know if you can still hear me. Shall I talk?
Thank you. Okay, we have another question or comment here. Thank you.
My name's Squadron Leader, retired Robin Green, and my comment, and in fact, Lynette, who I think was trying to say something there, last year, Lynette and I put together a dinner at the end of the Meritorious Unit Citation weekend event, and Lynette's very strongly involved with Rwandans down in Canberra. And when we were talking about a guest speaker for the night, she very much wanted to have a Rwandan representation. So what we decided to do was, rather than actually have any Australians speak, because we a lot of us know our stories, even though a lot of other people don't, we felt, because it was a meritorious time, it was a time that we were being recognised for our service, we wanted it to be something very positive. And she was able to organise some wonderful Rwandan speakers that night that came, and then on the Sunday held a small gathering of people that were interested in finding out things that we may be able to do back in Rwanda or being part of a community. And I think the feedback that we got from that was amazing. The amount of people who had been to Rwanda in our contingents that came back afterwards and said, wow, it was so good for the first time, rather than listening to us talk about ourselves and experiences, to hear from actual Rwandans that lived there during that time, or were small children and have grown up since, that live here in Australia or go between the two countries. It was so refreshing to hear from them and their stories, and it did a lot of people's mental health the world of good, and be able to, for some people it was able to close a little door maybe, for others close a door for that period of time to move on to the next. But I really would recommend highly that we do try and do something where we can interface so much more with the Rwandan community here in Australia, because I'm sure we could probably be as much help to them as they I know can be to us. And I want to thank those people very much that came last year and gave of themselves at all the events, but in particular at the dinner, because it was a really fabulous thing. And I know that wasn't a question, I'm sorry, but I just did want to say that there are little things in small pockets happening to try and get those connections there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Robin. Really appreciate it. Let's see if we can take a lightning round of questions. Over there, we have someone. Just put up your hand. And while you're moving on that side, I just wanted to mention that Bertrand had a whole range of people who he wanted to mention and thank in his speech. And because he couldn't be here in person, we had to change things around a little bit. But I just want to really also thank our partners who have partnered with us for this event. I'll leave it to Theophila at the end to mention our partners also. But thank you, everyone, also for being here. We have Rwandans here, community leaders, I think from every state in Australia, which is quite amazing. And this is during the time of COVID. So, so thank you for coming. All right, let's hear the question over there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Eddie. A Rwandan born during genocide. I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Tracy and the last speaker. I've forgotten the name. My apologies. Yeah. My question is about, Dr. Tracy talked about viewing her experiences in Rwanda as positive. And I want to acknowledge the resilience that comes with that. It's not an easy thing. And having overcome, I'm thinking that she's had to overcome the stress, the post-traumatic stress that comes with that for her to be able to make such a point. So I'd like to pose this question that she talked about finding a sense of purpose to overcome the stress. What is it that gave her a sense of purpose? And I think partly I know the answer to that being in her profession. My question is in the sense that this could help Australians as well as Rwandans healing from the traumatic experiences that they dealt with or they are still dealing with. But with Rwandans especially, it's not just a deal to do with it, with the stress. It's also a deal to do with forgiveness, because for Rwandans still living in Rwanda, they coexist with people who are actually committing these crimes. So how do you find a sense of purpose worthy enough to overcome the stress that comes with that and also to forgive? Thank you.
Well, that's a really big question. And, you know, I can talk from my point of view, I guess, and in terms of, it's pretty much what I was talking about during my talk. I found a sense of purpose in the work we're able to do in the hospital, the difference we were able to make. As Blair so lovely, you know, well put it, every little life that you save or that you influence can have a really huge ripple effect on the country. So you do your little bits, then each of us doing our little bit was then able to make a difference to people's lives. But, you know, look, there's no easy path for a lot of this sort of stuff. You know, I think the forgiveness thing is a very important part. It's, I know there's some of my fellow peacekeepers who really still feel that, you know, there wasn't a strong reason or purpose that we went to Rwanda. You know, from why in Australia did we go all of that way? I was able to say, well, we're going all that way to make a difference and we're Australians and that's what we do. But I know that that is not easy for everyone. But in terms of that broader purpose, you know, the other thing I'd say is that I ended up becoming the Surgeon General of the Australian Defence Force. So that's the chief doctor, if you like. And I always say I wouldn't have even still been serving if it hadn't been for my time in Rwanda and what I learned from that and how I grew from that. But it also meant that when I was in that seat, I had lived experience of, you know, traumatic experiences. I was able to understand, I was able to think of my friends and colleagues who've developed PTSD. And I was able to commit myself and my team to make sure that mental health was a priority. I think Blair it was who said that, you know, things are a lot better than they were then. I think they are. There is always still work to be done. And I think particularly now that I'm a reservist, the transitioning out of Defence Force in particular still needs a lot of work. But hopefully I took those experiences there and was able then to make some sort of difference in the Australian Defence Force as well, in terms of continually reminding senior officers about the price people pay. We put people in, I like to say, I don't like it, but I like to say, we put people in harm's way deliberately in the Australian Defence Force. There's not too many other organisations that say that. We actually deliberately put people in harm's way to get the job done. So we have an overwhelming duty of care to our people to make sure we support them when that happens. And if we don't provide that support, then we fail. So I was able to give those messages loud and clear to people, and I think hopefully, you know, make it so that things are getting better again on that journey that we've been on. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
I guess one thing I'll pass on to you in a second, sorry, but I'd just like to add to that. As a public historian, it's my job to try and tell very difficult and complicated material to the general public, often to people who might come to the Australian War Memorial who don't even know that Australians are in Rwanda, or it's quite a difficult and challenging job. But one thing I need to think about as a historian is what is the narrative that we're going to tell in our galleries. Traditionally in Australia, the narrative has been very much about Kibeho, because that was an event that Australians were at. It's an event that was very well photographed. And so most people who know anything about Australians in Rwanda might know about the Kibeho massacre, and that's about it. But what I'm hearing, and I'd love to hear from more people if you'd like to reach out to me, is perhaps that narrative isn't about this one event on this one day, but it's about the lives we were able to save. We saved far more lives than were lost on that one day. And maybe that is the narrative of Australians in Rwanda, and that's something we should be considering. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
Just from my own perspective,
this panel is running itself. I like it.
Excellent. I actually deployed, and members of the second contingent with public affairs deployed. There were 4 people all up. Effectively, I'm the only one that's not TPI. So our people being, if you can think of the job that we did to a large extent, it was like acting as a uniform war correspondent. So we went everywhere that there were Australian troops. We saw all the worst things. In fact, the camera person for the second contingent by the name of Robin White filmed what happened in Kibeho. So that might give you some context of the sort of things. So if there's a group of people that tend to, other than the int people, the intelligence people getting out and seeing it all, it was public affairs because the media wanted to see it too. So we had to be there. And when they weren't there, we also wanted to tell the story of what our Australians were doing. The reality with serving in the military, as Tracy said, is you put yourself in harm's way. It's the nature of your business. For my personal experience, yes, I had issues when I returned from Rwanda. I was in Townsville. Not long after that, well, in fact, in 96, we had the Black Hawk tragedy where 18 service personnel were killed during counterterrorism operations. That's 5 aviation and special forces. I knew some of those people. So obviously my recovery from Rwanda and seeing those things, and particularly it relates to children and what I saw over there. But then to see another piece of trauma, and I'll be quite honest, I managed to deal with it for quite some years, but it came back with a vengeance. Probably, I would say, about 6 or 7 years after I returned. But I've been able to, through the strength that Tracy talks about, say, well, hang on, I can handle that. I can handle a lot of things. And then I managed to become a councillor. I was the mayor of the city of Ryde. I ran my own business. I started my own business. I've been director on a number of different boards and so forth. And I think, if anything, because you were pushed to the limit, which you were in that mission, and you thought you survived that, that gave you the strength to say, gee whiz, this world's a tough world, a lot of unfairness out there, but I believe I can make things better. I can do good, and I'm not going to do that by sitting back. So, yes, there's a two-sided prong to service. And it is you people from Rwanda who I feel so sorry for in terms of what was happening, particularly the children. I remember the biscuit being shouted out to us. My ration pack always disappeared, of the biscuits and lollies always disappeared very quickly with the children. But that's a positive. But, you know, let's take it from the point of view that you're here. Australia is the best country in the world. And I believe that it has the best people in the world. And let me just say this, we've got to work together. We've got to understand why these tragedies occur. And you always will need defence forces to keep the peace and do the right thing. And you know what? You will always have a fair percentage of trauma and PTSD that comes out of that. There is no way of avoiding something that in our comfortable world where we go into an uncomfortable and horrific situation that we're not going to be affected. That's human nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I can see why you went into politics. Maybe there will be a return. You want to ask a question? Sure. Can I ask, let's do a lightning round, but excuse me, sir. Just let's do a lightning round. That means super short, sharp questions pointed to someone so that we can...
Leon, is Tracy here? Sorry, is Tracy here? There are a couple of questions online as well.
Okay. Would you like to just, because we can't see it, if you would like to choose 2 or 3.
Sure. I know Joe Hardy's had a little fake hand up for a long time there. So Joe, did you want to say something? Good.
But the moment has probably gone because the conversation's been so fantastic.
Sorry, Joe, we're struggling. Can you lean into your speaker?
Not very well.
Can you hear me, Tracy?
Not very well, unfortunately.
Okay, hang on. Let's see. I'll get into my my doohickey.
Maybe Tracy, let's go to the next question in the meantime, and then we come back to you.
I'm not sure, Lynette. Did you want to say something as well, Lynette? No,
I've just turned up my output.
Okay, Joe.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. We can hear you. Go ahead.
My output was down. So sorry. I did. I don't want to impact on Lynette's time though, because Lynette has so much more impact on how things have been since we returned. She's been working like a Trojan for the Rwandan community in Australia. I'm very proud to know her. The issues I was actually talking about, what I was talking, why I put my hand up in the beginning, was looking at a different side to the Cabello side of things, because I was there for Cabello, but I didn't go down to Cabello. I was in the intensive care unit. I've never stayed awake for so long in my life. It was quite an interesting time, if you remember, Tracy. I think I was sent to bed at some point, and it was a microcosm of the overall situation that we experienced. there were a couple of us that had critical care experience, and me being almost the most junior officer, but the most experienced critical care person to the contingent was very interesting for me, because I found that the younger people were struggling with the clinical side of things. Not that they struggled with doing what they had to do, but the aftermath of that, with all the death and the horrible injuries and things like that. Whereas we didn't suffer that because we were experienced clinicians. But there were other things. We were away from home. Most of us were reservists. So we were sort of thrust into an environment where we perhaps didn't know anybody, and I didn't know anybody until I was there. I'd only been in uniform 6 months, so I was still learning to tie up my boots. But I managed to find the bar, though, which was always very handy. But I also had different sorts of things that I've come home with. But I too have used the focus of, okay, well, what good can come out of this? And like the gentleman who spoke before, sorry, I came in late because I was at work. I've gone on and done other things too. My PhD was based on some particular clinical phenomena that I found in Rwanda, and I didn't get it done until the early 2000s. So, you know, there's lots of things that that can make you feel and make you come out of that shell of this was a horrible experience and make something positive from it. So I've done that PhD, and I'm now an academic, and I'm working through different things, and I'm actually starting to build a team right now. Some of these people are here, and we're going to research mental health for veterans on a different slant than what people are used to, because I've come to realise that there is a totally different slant to how people cope with these sorts of situations, isolated from their family in a threatened environment. And we need to actually get a full picture of these elements before we can actually move forward as a defence force and a nation helping other nations. So, yeah. And as far as what Tracy was saying about setting up an Tamar group, that's terrific. I have set up, I'm working as an admin for the Facebook page with the 2 other boys. I've also set up a post-75 veteran group here in Bendigo with the RSL, and we have a growing number of young veterans, and every year we march in Bendigo, and we're forever pulling in young people from the sidelines, because they don't know that we exist, because they've just come back to town or something. So that's a growing support network for young veterans. And basically it starts with, we have a Somalia vet, we have 2 Rwandan vets, that's me and my husband, and we have a lot of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the numbers are just growing. And it's wonderful that there's a young veteran network within the RSL. So, and they do a lot of work for the community too. So, yeah, very proud of that. So there are things that you can do, and Lynette, again, is doing a greater global sort of picture with her work with the Rwandan people. So I'll just pass over to Lynette now.
Okay, I think Lynette.
Oh dear.
So I think Lynette's having a few problems, so we might have to skip that. Sorry, Lynette.
Lynette, we'll make sure we pass on your message to the others. Maybe Tracy, if the 2 of you can send a message between one another, you can just say it out loud. But I do want to thank Joe also for talking about the emotional scars also. I arrived in Australia just almost nearly 3 years ago. And one of the first things I did was to attend the Invictus Games. And it was a really powerful experience for me to meet many of the athletes who were part of the Invictus Games. And the one thing that I came away with is not always the physical scars that hurt the most. It's often the emotional scars. And so I want to also reiterate, you know, what Blair mentioned earlier is tell your story. You have an individual story. And I want to ask those who listen to also suspend all judgment, because whether your story is positive or negative, it's still your story, and we need to allow space for those stories to be told. We have, let's just go to that gentleman. He's been waiting, and then I'm coming back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Thorjin Ngabo. I'm the Rwandan chairman of Queensland. Yeah, I would like first to recognize the job you work in Rwanda. And by now I have 3 questions and any of you can answer. The world today wants to know the truth about what happened in Kibeho. It was alleged that one of the causes that made the RPF to dismantle camps were militians who were inside the camp. After the camp was destroyed, did you see any weapons which were recovered there? That is my first question. Second question, using heavy weapon to destroy camp was the only way to use. There was no other mean which could have used to isolate militia from other civil like women and children. Number 3, last time when we were in Canberra, there is one survivor who currently lives in Norway. She recognized Dr. Tracy. She mentioned that they were working together. Lucky enough, she nearly killed while they were put her in the truck, which was heading from Gikongoro to Butare, and she was originating from Gikongoro or Kibeho. So she was wondering if you have any platform whereby someone who survived the atrocities of Kibeho can send her message, or any platform where they can share story. Those were my 3 concerns, and any one of you can answer me. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Delphine, can you just give the mic over here, please? So.
I think it's...
let's just hear this one quick question, and then we'll, sorry, Blair.
Yeah. My question is actually to the legal lady. Sorry, I've
KIRSTEN
forgotten your name. Are there still any prosecutions going ahead now, all these years later, of people that caused any of the atrocities over there? Is it still an active thing happening? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Thanks. Let's do the last one since you have the mic first, KIRSTEN, and then we'll move to Blair.
Sure. So the ICTR was originally set up as an ad hoc tribunal. I don't think the UN quite realized it would take so long to reach its mandate, but it finally finished in 2015, but they now have what is known as the residual mechanism. And that's a body that deals with both the ICTR for Rwanda and also for the ICTY in Yugoslavia, because clearly when you set up these tribunals, we have a lot of ongoing issues such as witness protection. So witnesses may give testimony under protection, and that remains, that's a court enforced order, and that remains. So over years, they still have to be able to ensure that protection is maintained or lift it if the witness wants to. There's still appeals pending, so a couple of appeals still to be done. And then I'm not sure if people saw in the news recently, probably the Rwandans here would have seen the news that Felicien Kabuga was arrested. I think it was last year. He was one of the most wanted people in the international world for the alleged crimes he had committed. He was one of the sort of alleged bankrollers. So he was arrested. It took an Australian who has been heavily involved in international criminal justice. He was working to track him down using quite intricate means, the same way that they managed to track down Karadzic and Mladic. And so that trial is now pending, and that will probably take some time. But after Kabuga, that should be probably the end, the end of it. Hopefully that answers everything. Okay.
The broader question, or the first 2 questions about weapons in the camp, as well as the means that the RPA had to close the camp. And I think the international tribunal that was doing, so the European observers who came to do the review of the camp, did collect a lot of information, and one of their points was that the Rwandan army only had lethal means at its disposal to close the camp. So, you know, this is one of the complex issues when you try to do something like this, is that, you know, if people are not going peaceably, if there is resistance in the camp, there is going to be violence, because they were not established for that purpose. They're not constabulary, they weren't police. I think in terms of information about what happened there and where people were returned to and the rest, there's certainly information on the UN side. I'm not sure a lot of the stuff has been released on the Australian side for the archives and the War. I might talk about that in a sec. But certainly the international tribunal that came to have a look at the camp, other investigations by the United Nations Assistance Missions in Rwanda, that information is there, so far as I know, in terms of putting together a larger picture of what occurred, and in some detail as well. So I don't think it's a lack of information out there about Kibeo and what happened. It's just that it's not easily acquired. It's not out there. I mean, this is all pre-internet as well. But they'll probably be the sources I'd go to. You know, our sources that are in the War Memorial, the UN and the International Tribunal reports will give you a lot of information. They did a lot of interviews and a lot of other research at the time into the incident. I think it's probably the best bet for the information. And I think it's on you, Dave, because you're more know about the
Dave, let's put you on the spot, and then I'm going to flick back to Tracy also. If you just have a comment ready from one of your colleagues, or a response to that one of those last questions. Thank you, David.
Yes, there are records related to the Kibeo massacre held in the archives of the Australian War Memorial and the National Archives of Australia, both in Canberra, and those have been kind of looked into extensively for the writing of the official history of Australian peacekeeping operations, which was released a few years ago, including the volume which covered Operation Tamar. So that's been quite well mined by the official historian who was working on that. That was Jean Bou. And in the text that he produced, he relies on those archives as well as the eyewitness accounts from the Australians today. It does focus on the Australian experience of those events, because it's the official history of the Australian Armed Forces, and puts it into a bit of international context. But a lot of the sources that we do have that were used in producing that official history were reports written by the person sitting right next to me. So it is just based on what the Australians experienced that were there at a higher kind of UN level and things like that. I'm sorry, I'm just not sure.
Thank you. Tracy?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually didn't. I didn't actually catch that last question. I think what happens when I'm on Zoom for longer than 2 hours, my brain starts to fall apart.
We zoom out.
I do. I zoom out. I can't remember what the question
was. The gentleman asked, mentioned there was someone who met you in Rwanda, if I understand that correctly. And there's a lady who asked whether there is a platform or something to help people to get in touch with you, to heal.
Well, I'm actually, for me personally,
You work together, apparently.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear from her. I'm pretty easy to find by Google.
I found you through Google, I think.
Exactly. My ANU details are on the Australian National University site. Or reach out on social media as well. Yes, I would love to be back in contact. I do have Lynette. I think she's mastered the technology now.
Excellent. Lynette.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Just for the recent question about Kibeo, and I'm definitely not an expert, I'm not saying I am, there's 2 books you can get that talk about that, and it's called The Shallow Graves of Rwanda, and it was written by the UN envoy at the time, Khan, Khan, I'll just, if you can see it. And there's also a book called Why Comrades Go to War, which is also written by Philly Rossier. I'll put them on the UNAMIR website, and if anyone wants to know about them and how to get them. The other thing about connecting people with, you know, veterans and Rwandans and anyone in between. There are groups that are, you know, that we are meeting with. We're doing things together, both in Rwanda and in Australia, trying to understand each other's, learn from each other's perspectives, and also support Rwandans in Rwanda through COVID. And, you know, just to get together and have a meal together, which has been really helpful for me and for others. We have also, myself personally, I've worked with the Consular General on a program that would assist Rwandans and veterans getting together. It actually took a bit of a dive whilst COVID's been happening, but we hope to refloat it and get it going. So if you need to talk to me or would like to talk to me, just send me an email at ljhmanster@gmail.com. I'll have it on the web. All right. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you so much. And we're getting, unfortunately, to that time where we've run out of time. I know a lot of people have traveled from far to get here. Some still have to go back. But I'm getting to one of the most exciting parts of this event. I'm going to introduce a poet, a very young poet by the name of Mr. Akano Amuda. He is also a Blacktown City Council Youth Ambassador and please come up on the stage. And let me just tell you that he wrote this poem fairly recently. I was quite surprised. I felt quite emotional after I heard this. And he wrote this poem for both for the peacekeepers who served in Operation Tamar and for the people of Rwanda, of all identity groups. So we thank you, please.
Thank you so much for your kind and eloquent introduction. I really appreciate it. Just want to make sure this is right. First of all, as you already said, my name is Akano Amuda. I am a 19-year-old student studying university. I don't study university, studying law and commerce in the University of Notre Dame. And yeah, what a great pleasure it is to be here to talk about an issue that is so dear to my heart and such an inevitable event in our modern history. In the dawn of 1994, something terrible was lurking under the dark covers of Rwanda's skies. It is but the prejudice of man, the rage of hate that laid this part of the world, that poured out the rich sweet wine of humanity and laid this part of the world open to untold horrors, unspeakable deeds, unwarranted, vast human suffering, where the tears of children hold no power, the cries of mothers cannot stop the swinging of the blades, where the human consciousness of your own neighbors became devoid of any moral sensation. The issue here is about justice. It is about humanity. It is about the cries of those innocent victims singing never again must this untold horror happen to succeeding generation. I can still hear the echoes of those victims crying out through the long vistas of time, asking, where is justice? Where is justice? Where is the radiant promises of justice? Where is the promises of the founding fathers of the UN Charter, vowing to protect succeeding generations in its most needed hour? Where is justice? All I can say is that even if you are beyond the striking distance of the legal gavel, no man can escape this trumpet sound of justice or outrun the voices of the victims. James Russell Lowe's word is too true. Beyond its truth forever on the scaffold, long, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And beyond the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. even after we thought it was over. After the silence of the guns and the hourly clashing of the blood-red machete. After the rich human lives have been compressed into mere figures and numbers. And the somber regrets of the Security Council noted. After we thought the fair flower of unity had begun going again, 1995 brought us another horror on the grim April in the Kibeho refugee camp, where unarmed men, women, and innocent children were brutally massacred and tipped into the crowded, lonely graves of human masses. Our deployed peacekeepers were there, shackled by the UN mandate, which prevented the use of arms. They still felt the spirit of duty's call, treating the wounded, giving aid to those suffering in pain, perhaps giving some solace to the anguishing souls nearing the early sound of the last mortal round. For these men and women were courageous. Courage is a reason that all the men and women, all of our military should be honored for their service. For they pledged the ultimate sacrifice that any man can make to risk their lives in service, near and far, for country, for family, and for the goodness of humanity. Overworked and undercared for, some of our men have left foreign fields physically intact, but psychologically handicapped in the midnight sleep. Some of our veterans are still sleeping rough on the cold streets of our inner cities. We must care for our servicemen as they have cared for us. How quickly do we forget that the sweet wine of the liberty that we enjoy today has been brewed only by the sacrifice of our fallen sons? Those men and women ready at any moment to give up all those years to be of youth and of joy, to rise up and answer the nation's call, to ensure that all that makes life worth living, justice, liberty, remains in our democratic creed. Thank you from the Rwandan Community of Australia.
Thank you so much. That was emotional, but really moving. Thank you. Now I would like to invite the President of the Federation of Rwandan Communities in Australia, Mr. Theophile Habarimana. Please welcome. Thank you.
Ladies, gentlemen, and your excellence, dear friends who served in Operation Tamar, on this special commemorative event on 26th anniversary of Australians' participation in Operation Tamar, on behalf of the Federation of Rwandan Communities in Australia, and on my own behalf, allow me to say, first and foremost, what can I explain my cannot express the gratitude I feel when I think about that the Australian brave soldiers who participate in the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, have done during the carnage of thousands of internal displaced people that occurred at the Kibeho camp, southwest Rwanda, on April 22nd, 1995. It's open secret that the massacre was ordered by the new Rwandan government and carried out by the Rwandan Patriotic Army. UN peacekeeping soldiers on the scene were left to watch helpless from the sideline as men, women, and children were gunned down and cut to pieces by machete in cold blood. Why? Because of their rules of engagement, even no single bullet was fired by Australian peacekeepers, their presence was somehow dissuasive. Many believe without this presence, no single displaced of Kibeo camp would have survived the massacre. Secondly, as the great speakers who spoke before me, lightly said, I would like to pay tremendous respect and homage to the women and men who put their life on the line to save the people in danger. Looking at how obliged and indebted we are feeling toward those greatest Australian soldiers, we have realized that kindness and altruism are some of greatest weapon any person can ever have. Thank you a million. Third, as I own all the Australian peacekeepers, resounding tribute from the courage, perseverance, and self-discipline which they have shown in the most difficult circumstances. I also recognize that Kibeo massacre was a horrific event for all members of the Australian forces. And many who served, their later being diagnosed was post-traumatic stress disorder. To those who suffered from PTSD and other psychological illness, I express my deep sympathy for what happened or happening to them after saving the cause of humanity. Finally, the member of the Australian contingent of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, deployed to Kibeo displaced personnel camp, have witnessed firsthand the horrible slaughter of innocent people. Verbal and enlightened testimonies have been given. The big frustration of the people of Rwanda, certainly shared with the member of the Australian contingent still alive, it is that all the testimonies seems to have been shelved or buried for good. 26 years after this barbaric program, no sign that victims and survivors will get any kind of justice. Since Kibeo, the government of Rwanda has always been immune from the consequences of its actions and continue to commit massive blood claims inside as well outside of the country. By the way of conclusion, I therefore make a strong appeal to the government of Australia to use its leverage to unearth all the reports related to Kibeho massacres and help the victim of Kibeho to get justice. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you for your attendance and thank you for attention. God bless you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Teofil Hawarimana, the president of the FRCA. Now, for the closing, I'd like to invite again Teofil to give a thank you, I guess, symbol from the FRCA or from the Rwandans in general to our guests, to our panelists. We have some symbolic, probably you guys who've been to Rwanda, you know the little symbols we called agaseke. They're like some of the traditional things we use, some of traditional symbols, Rwandan traditional symbols, just as a note of thank you and remembrance for your support and also for being with us here today, remembering the Operation Tamar. Thank you. So I think we can you ladies help? Yeah, bring them in here. Thank you.
Thank you again. Yeah, there's a small message from the member of all Rwandan community in Australia. It's a small gift, it's a small sign, but it's a big remembering from our heart. We are no longer friends. We are brothers and sisters. I would like to request my colleague, the leader of from Adelaide, to give to Dr. David SUTTON a certificate and a small gift. Mr. Teofil, you can handle the gift to Mr. So Tracy is not here. Plan data.
I think we can, I guess we can sort that out later. We just thank you for being here with us. Yeah.
We have also the gift for KIRSTEN. Okay. KIRSTEN. We have also the for Mr. Williams.
Thank you so much, Teofil and the community leaders. Thank you. And thank you so much. Yeah, and that concludes our event tonight. I would like again to thank you for being here with us as we commemorate or remember the Operation Tamar. We thank our guests, we thank our panelists, and we thank everyone who's followed online. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you.